the Law for Black Lives monthly webinar. We're super excited. Today we're talking about reproductive justice, how to organize, advocate, and agitate from a reproductive justice lens. And we have an incredible panel of folks who are going to share about their own legal practice and their organizing practice around reproductive justice. I'm going to start with a quick, a 30-minute introduction to reproductive foundations and values in the lens from Sister Reach, and then have a panel discussion followed by asking each of you to share any questions or thoughts that you might have. Law for Black Lives is a network of over 3,400 lawyers, legal advocates, and organizers across the country who are committed to Black liberation. And we're super excited from a webinar series and a bunch of other stuff we have. We have a newsletter coming out soon that will announce the sites of our 12 locations for our listening to, and also today launched a new legal innovation fellowship for folks who are trying to practice movement lawyering in Black communities and need some financial and resource support. So we hope you'll check us out on the website at law4blacklives.org to learn more about all of that. And again, welcome you and appreciate your time tonight for this really important discussion about reproductive justice and the place and role of lawyers and advocates in that fight. So I'll pass it on to Christina to introduce the panel.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be introducing Cherise Scott, who has worked as an educator, advocate, and activist in reproductive justice for over 10 years. In 2011, Scott has relocated from Memphis, Tennessee to Chicago and later founded Sister Reach, which is currently the only reproductive justice organization in the state of Tennessee. Under Ms. Scott's leadership, Sister Reach has released their 2015 report on the need for comprehensive sexuality education for Southern youth of color, rolled out their pro-women billboard campaign in opposition to anti-abortion billboards erected in Memphis targeting Black men, rolled out their state and nationally based clergy cohort, which trains faith leaders on social justice issues, and they have also presented to the United Nations regarding the impact of the fetal assault law on Tennessee women. Sister Reach's work on the fetal assault law led to the victory in defeating House Bill 1660, which attempted to criminalize mothers struggling with drug addiction during the 2016 legislative session. Ms. Scott is currently the chair of Memphis Teen Vision, which was featured on NBC News #31 Days of Feminism campaign. She is a 2016 Rockwood Institute Fellow and is sought out as a public speaker on reproductive justice and other human rights issues, and works diligently with national partners and coalitions to bring awareness to human rights injustices of Tennesseans. So thank you so much, Cherise. I'm going to pass it off to you. We're so lucky to have you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me and allowing Sister Reach to be a part of this presentation. I am going to share my screen so that we can just jump right into the presentation, and I guess we'll open it up for questions when you all are ready for that part. So let me share my screen, share my desktop. Awesome. Of course, I'm looking at my crazy desktop, but that is what it is. Okay. Let me move this out of the way. So definitely going to talk a little bit about reproductive justice and then offer some tips that we feel make sense when we start talking about legal advocacy as reproductive justice advocates, and kind of what we would like to see from the legal community, actually. And so, I don't know if you all can you see this little thing I'm moving around? Can y'all see that? Not sure. Okay, I'll move to the side. But what we're going to cover is a little bit about Sister Reach. We'll talk about our reproductive justice core principles. We'll talk about reproductive justice as a winning strategy, reproductive oppression, intersectionality. We'll talk a little bit about the 8 categories of human rights. I think that's relevant for this conversation. And then an intersectional vision to achieve reproductive justice. So a little bit about Sister Reach. Currently, we're the only RJ organization in the state of Tennessee. We work specifically with women and girls of color, poor women, rural folks, gender non-conforming people, and their families. For us, that also includes men and boys. We work from a 4-pronged strategy of education, policy, advocacy and culture change work. Some of the work includes our Sister Reach Youth Ambassador program, where we've been working with young people since about 2012, educating them about their bodies and preparing them to advocate on behalf of themselves and their own communities and their peers, training them to do sex education with one another, as well as preparing them to speak with legislators and the school board. Some of our education programs is our Vacation Body School program. We do a lot of school and community-based sex education. Our Vacation Body School is a faith-based program where after the law around sex education changed in the state of Tennessee, we just found different ways and more creative ways to access young people and teach them about their bodies. So we partner with local churches around the city in order to do that. We do quite a lot of outreach and mobilization work. That looks anything like community discussions, town halls. It could even be, arts and activism related type of events. Trainings and workshops. We offer reproductive justice trainings. What we'll do today is a bit of an overview, but we're always open to do reproductive justice trainings for folks, several different types of workshops, presentations on pretty much all of the work that we've been working on since our founding. As well, we have our CSE for Tennessee campaign, which is a campaign that we rolled out last year, just trying to educate community members, parents, and other important stakeholders about the need for ComSex ed in the state. We do a significant portion of voter engagement work. We have a practical support fund called TNRAF, where we're helping young women and young people who need access to practical support, like a hotel and or lodging or transportation in the midst of them trying to get their abortion taken care of. Sometimes it's these types of things, childcare, that hinder women from being able to get an abortion procedure many times, and sometimes she'll just avoid it because she can't afford it. So that's something that we offer. We have a Boy Talk program, our Boy Talk program, which centers masculine of-center women and does advocacy work specific to their needs, reproductive and sexual health centered as well. And then, we work with our partners like Law for Black Lives, like Black Lives Matter. We work with several partners on work that is important to them that, if we were to add a reproductive justice lens, language, or advocacy around, we even help to further the work that they're trying to do and give, a bit more information and education specific to like how to talk about different work from this kind of lens of reproductive justice from this human rights perspective. So a little bit about reproductive justice, the definition. First of all, that every woman has the human right to decide, if and when she's going to have a baby, and the conditions under which she'll give birth. For us, that means, if she even wants to have a baby, she may or may not, but she should have, she should be able to be self-determining and decide when she wants to get pregnant or when she doesn't want to be pregnant. And then those conditions could mean, something like for low-income women, poor women having access to a doula or a midwife, even though they may only be able to access Medicaid and or some type of state-run or state-provided healthcare insurance. So, it shouldn't matter if she's poor, whether or not she's able to access the type of maternal health needs that she desires. Then to decide if she doesn't want to have a baby and her options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. This also includes if she will, maybe she wants an abortion, maybe she wants to have access to adoption services. So that's something, that we want to make sure that she has access to, that there's no stigmatization, that there's no barriers that she's facing because maybe of her social economic status, her race, her class, her sexual orientation. And then her options for preventing or ending a pregnancy could definitely mean an abortion, or it could mean ComSex ed, having access to sex education. It could mean having access to to contraception that is affordable and accessible in her community. And then to parent the kids that she already has with the necessary social supports and safe environments. I think that one of the big things that we have to understand is that many of the women and girls we are fighting for and families that we're fighting for are people who already have children. more than not. And so we want to make sure that if a woman has children, that she is able to parent those young people in an environment, it could be within her house. Is she a victim of domestic violence, or in her community? Is her community heavily policed? And are her children objects of racial profiling? Or is she? Is her spouse? Is her partner? So definitely thinking about what safe communities really look like. Social supports, does she have proper housing? Does she have access to proper foods? Does she live in a food desert? Those types of things. Is her community healthy? Is there, and the fear of violence from individuals or the government could absolutely include, like I said, it could be, she could be in some type of domestic situation that is harmful for her or her children. Or, the way that legislation plays out in the lives of vulnerable people comes across as violence, when you are limiting people's opportunities to access things that are a part of basic human rights. And then lastly, one that we've added that was not a part of the initial core reproductive justice principles and specific to the work that we do is the right to express sexuality and spirituality without violence or shame. And so we want to make sure that, as folks are living their lives, regardless of, whatever their sexuality is, that they can do that in a way that does not impede them from living a full life or, spirituality. They should not be racially profiled because, they're wearing an hijab. They should not be racially profiled, for possibly being a terrorist. And then, or you could be a white person in America and actually be acting as a terrorist and be called something totally different, humanized even. So when we think about, what shame, what violence looks like to vulnerable people, we have to also consider these pieces as well. As far as reproductive justice as a winning strategy, reproductive justice definitely started as a womb-centered framework, really, centering the lives of women, vulnerable women. It has been, since then, since 1994, really evolved into a very intersectional and expansive idea of what reproductive justice is and means, really representing the rights of all people, especially gender nonconforming people, trans folks, LGBT folks, all people as well. It's not about, just about abortion, even though, unfortunately, it has gotten lost in translation. It's been quite watered down over the years, where folks are trying to kind of box it into this abortion-only lens, when reproductive justice speaks to the whole woman's life, not just not just her right to access an abortion, or her, or legislators, or attacking legislators, or coming after legislators for taking away a person's right to an abortion. Reproductive justice actually connects reproductive health and rights issues to some of those other important issues in our lives, right? We're not just a single issue as far as our lives. And so we don't do this framework, in a single lens type or single issue strategy. So we, making sure that we're adding pieces to this puzzle, like racism and economic justice, domestic violence, sexual assault, different forms of oppression that impact the life of one person or impact the life of an entire community. So definitely bring those pieces into it. And so the RJ framework offers new ways of thinking and strategizing. Definitely, this partnership with RJ advocates working alongside and inside of the Law for Black Lives, I think is an amazing example of what partnership can look like when you bring folks together. And then for us, we wanted to define our common problem as reproductive oppression, so that we can, really think of a catalytic way to move forward and really push this vision forward. And so when we think about reproductive oppression, and definitely wanting to, have lawyers who are on here, folks who are advocating for people from the legal community, to really think about this term of reproductive oppression. The definition is the control and exploitation of women, girls, and gender nonconforming individuals through our bodies, sexuality, labor, fertility, in violation of our human rights. And so regardless of whether or not we're talking about myself, basically, on an ad, where where I was quoted through with, pro-lifers. They took a quote that I stated in something that I wrote and tried to, I guess, basically use that against me. But the bottom line is that for many Black women in particular, especially in a climate of police sanctioned violence, that bringing a child into this world, or not bringing a child into this world, for many mothers, especially Black mothers, has become an act of love, for sure. And this is not something that's new. That's something that we can track all the way back to slavery, with mothers, killing their own children in the field to stop the master from being able to put that child to the lash or put that child into slavery. This isn't anything new, right? This is what we've seen in the history of Black people in this country, Black women in this country, Black mothers in this country. The Black Lives Matter movement, understanding that if we can't live whole lives and not have to worry about being murdered, then that's a reproductive injustice, actually, that women even have to consider an abortion is a reproductive injustice in order to not bring a child into a world that won't educate them, make sure that social supports are provided properly for them, and then, won't prepare them to be true contributors in society, but only prepare them to get routed back into a system of mass incarceration. So at Sister Reach, we don't necessarily talk about the school to prison pipeline. We talk about the womb to prison pipeline, because we've absolutely seen legislation begin, criminalizing mothers while babies are in utero. And so, there is no, it lessens the chances for women, especially women of color, young women, to be able to live a healthy life and raise a healthy family, under these types of circumstances. Voter ID laws, also in reproductive injustice. The Free Marissa Now campaign that was led by Sister Song down in Atlanta. The sister is released now, and I actually got a chance to meet her for the first time this past weekend. And it was just a wonderful experience. But the fact that she basically still has a mark on her record for trying to protect herself from a domestic violence situation where her husband was about to beat her, and she fired a warning signal into the air to make him leave and leave her alone. And unfortunately, what that turned into is her potentially serving 60 years in prison for potentially endangering the lives of her children because there was a gun. And, no responsibility for her not being able to lead a safe and healthy life with those same babies, because domestic violence laws and are weak in the state of Florida. They're weak in the country, period. And so, we think about that when we think about reproductive oppression. The Fight for 15 campaign absolutely overlaps the reproductive justice movement. If a person can't afford to have children, they may not have children. They may have an abortion. They may not, they may, have to give their babies away. They may have their children taken from them. These are issues that happen when economic issues are at play, economic disparities are at play. Even down to the missing DC girls, right? If anything, similar happens to them that happened to, the young women that were taken in Nigeria a few years ago, what we know is that those young women were routed into the sex trade. And so then, what is this? For us, this looks the same. It's just happening on American soil. So reproductive oppression absolutely is a way to think about talking about, the things that women and girls have to navigate, the issues that are at play in their lives, and those intersecting issues controlling the life of the woman, and her ability to parent, her ability to, to be an asset to her family or to her community. Some examples that are current examples of reproductive oppression, especially here in the state of Tennessee, the loss of the ACA and the fact that Republicans still haven't figured out, anything else, prohibiting comp sex ed across the South for the most part, restricting and criminalizing immigrant families, focusing on a wall instead of focusing on families. Incarceration and coercive contraceptive practices for drug-dependent mothers. I work on the fetal assault law. Absolutely is speaking to that. The current work that we have, we're doing a research project to just, listen to women, and we're talking to women across the state who were potentially impacted or were impacted by the fetal assault law, which basically could place a mother in prison up to 15 years if she tested positive for an opiate in her system. Lack of housing and protection for trans folks in crisis. That's still an epidemic proportion here in our city and our state. We have folks who are working to make sure that there is domestic violence housing for trans women and opportunities for them to get back on their feet. But the bottom line is that, more than not, there is nowhere for a trans woman to go, a trans man to go, if they are victims of domestic violence and or if they are homeless. And it's not, and sure, I guess a trans person could go to a shelter, and then we still have to think about, is that a safe environment for a trans person? Lack of culturally competent public health analysis for maternal health disparities among women of color. We continue to see that as an issue here in the state of Tennessee, including the fact that, Tennessee has made long-acting reversible contraception available to low-income women, to undocumented women, but still will not expand Medicaid so that those same women can choose for themselves what they want, get the doctor that they want, and make the health decisions that they need to make. Criminalizing people with HIV is a growing issue here in the state of Tennessee. We've seen down in Mississippi, HIV positive mothers are losing custody of their children. Limiting access to in vitro fertilization services for same gender couples in southern states, most places, and I mean, really, I'm giving you a list of stuff that you could literally be working on, right? That are RJ-centered issues that could totally be that could be worked on. Food deserts, refusal to expand the minimum wage. These are examples that we find to be quite problematic. And when these things are at play, trying to parent is almost impossible. So we think about reproductive justice in this kind of three-dimensional way, the theory piece, the intellectual piece, for analyzing how we think about these issues and develop solutions for the issues that we're fighting for. I think a lot of times people get a bit hung up here. We want to move folks to the strategy piece, really thinking about how we bring intersectionality in and some other types of strategy to kind of push human rights, or to at very least lift up human rights and justices. So we definitely want to use strategy to connect those disparate social justice and human rights issues and movements together. And then practice, movement building. This is where we want to be, right? We want to get to this place more than anything. Using self-help and base building to connect those personal and lived experiences to political activism, or in your case, to connect those lived experiences and personal issues to legal advocacy. We want to definitely, make sure that our legal community has enough information so that it can fight on our behalf in a way that doesn't put us in further harm or further danger. But, adds language that maybe isn't normally used by the legal community, but is more specific, it is more advocacy-centered language, but totally, can communicate exactly what women are facing, even in a court of law. And then that word intersectionality. What is it, right? So the study of intersections between forms of systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination, evolving into an entire complex of social behaviors, systems of advantages and disadvantages depending on markers of difference, not as an account of identity, but an explanation of power disparities. And so you definitely want to think about the way that, these interconnected disparities are impacting the lives of anybody, of people. Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, was the coiner of this phrase. And what specifically around the ways that multiple oppressions were impacting the lives of Black women. But as we have, been able to apply intersectionality in these other ways, this is, language, this is strategy that that absolutely can be used in order to fight on behalf of or advocate on behalf of your clients. It dates back to Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman declaration, really making the distinction between herself as a Black woman and white women. The treatment of her compared to the treatment of white women. That model was developed by women of color in the 60s and 70s, addressing how those oppressions based on race, class, and gender affect us. Expanded in recent years to include age, ability, sexual preference, immigration status, and so on and so forth, national origin, so that we, again, moving us from the womb-centered piece into more of this expansive frame of talking about reproductive justice and applying that to all lives. Challenges single issue organizing, addresses those multiple identities that we all have, and absolutely speaks to the fact that that multiple oppressions are existing at the same time in the lives of people. So we can talk about, what's happening in Chicago. We could talk about 500 deaths in the summer, or we could talk about the lack of poverty. We could, the exacerbation of poverty, lack of jobs, inadequate education, lack of literacy, those types of issues. We can talk about the crime, or we could talk about the things that cause the crime, right? So when we think about those multiple oppressions, I think this is always going to be a great strategy for the legal community to use, and at the very least trying to get compassion, or to at the very least humanize, a person who you are representing. And then we're all serving and fighting for the same people. I think it's really important to bring as many of our collective power and strategies together that we have in order to fight for the lives of people. The 8 categories of human rights, I've added this slide to the presentation just to let you know that all of this is reproductive justice, okay? All of it, absolutely, every last piece of it. The civil, political, economic, social, cultural, environmental, developmental, or sexual rights of people, all are a part of that person's life, right? If these things are not in play, that woman, that child, that man, that boy, that person absolutely can't live to their full potential. It is our job to make sure that we're lifting up every piece of their lives, and especially when we're advocating on behalf of them. Like we said in the prior slide, if the civil rights are not in place, then you can't expect the political rights to be in place. If economic rights are not in place, how could you assume that social rights would be in place, and so on and so forth, right? So when we think about, how we, advocate for folks who want to integrate all of these pieces in, to this kind of intersectional way of thinking, this intersectional way of fighting, this intersectional way of explaining, why a woman needed to use a hanger in order to have an abortion, right? Why a woman crossed state lines in order to have a baby so that she's not arrested for opiates in her system. Why, young people decide to be, why young people are homeless. Especially those who are LGBT, and why that's an issue, that's the responsibility not only, of their parents, but of our state, to provide, housing and to really shift the way that we're talking about sexuality in a way that doesn't shame and vilify, but humanizes, and they're still children, they're still babies. So definitely thinking about the human rights. So when you're fighting for reproductive justice, just know that you're fighting for all of this, sexual rights, all of it. You're fighting for every piece of this. And so to leave out any piece of this really, unfortunately for us, is an irresponsible way to do the work. So we definitely say that this is the way that's important for us. Some legal challenges and opportunities. First of all, legal protection, equaling enforcing laws to protect our choices in health. I mean, that's what we need. Legal protection basically to protect our human rights. Here are some issues, some different situations where, we're seeing, where we need the legal community. We need the legal community to help us fight the shackling of incarcerated women, to make sure that same gender couples have access to in vitro fertilization services, or even just a single heterosexual woman can have access to in vitro fertilization services with or without a spouse. you know, to help fight this growing HIV criminalization piece that is happening. You know, while we work kind of in tandem to continue to educate folks about what HIV is, you would think that by now, you know, folks would know how to contract it and not contract HIV, you know, what it is and what it's not, but still, you know, we're all having to fight, you know, some of the same very basic fights that we have had to, you know, over the last 25, 30 years that we've seen HIV on the scene. And then the sterilization and coercive practices that are happening. I mean, right here in the state of Tennessee, we are seeing sterilization happening, legal sterilization happening, right? And happening, impacting the lives of those who are incarcerated. You know, what happened to folks in jail having human rights, you know? So, you know, when you're offered something, you know, and you're in a vulnerable position, you're offered, you know, time off your sentence if you get a vasectomy, or, you know, time off your sentence if you get a long-acting reversible contraceptive method inserted into your vagina. You know, these are things that we need our legal community to help us fight. You know, these are some of the challenges that we're facing, some of the things that has been quite hard to fight. And, you know, and these are, you know, points of entry and opportunities for us to figure out ways to move the work forward. Some of the challenges for us look like, you know, for example, lack of legal protection, laws or enforcement of laws to protect an individual's right to reproductive health care services. You know, strategy for that could look like, you know, primary strategy could be legal and legislative advocacy at the state and federal levels. Other challenges, emphasis on individual choice obscures the social context. So definitely, you know, when we forget about these other things that are happening in the lives of people, in which individuals make choices. And then another strategy, that the core strategy of calling on women to exercise their voting rights or call or email their elected officials assumes a level of knowledge, access to elected officials, belief in the effectiveness of the political system, and or in this case, the legal system, that women, you know, who are marginalized by the myriad of things often don't have access to. So when we think about some of these challenges, you know, definitely some of the disparities, you know, that we're seeing, you know, include these things. But, you know, especially when we're thinking about how we integrate women into fighting for themselves, you know, it's not always possible depending on her socioeconomic status or immigration status, you know, and definitely her belief. So I think that, you know, there's an important challenge that you all have at this point to instill some belief system that the law works in the lives of people, especially, you know, in a time of Black Lives Matter, when we've seen, you know, officer after officer after officer not be held accountable for what is clearly misconduct, what is clearly murder. Some opportunities for effective advocacy. I think it's really imperative that, you know, the legal community works with the reproductive health rights and justice folks to really advocate properly for women impacted by anti-woman policies or anti-abortion policies. One woman in particular is the Anna Yonka case of a white woman in Middle Tennessee who used a hanger last year to have an abortion. You know, she wasn't able to complete it. You know, she ended up going to jail. She ended up taking a plea deal. And we're still talking about a white woman, right? So if that woman would have been Black, what would have happened? If that woman would have been brown, what would have happened? But I think it's really important to lift up the fact that there were some legal advocacy challenges there, because this isn't something that a lawyer had to fight in the state before. You know, what it looks like, or what it has looked like now for that lawyer compared to in the beginning when he was fighting for her, possibly not having the proper language, not understanding the importance of, you know, kind of the rah-rah, you know, that advocacy organizations like a Sister Reach would do on his behalf for her, right? You know, we're not necessarily expecting lawyers, you know, to be, you know, in front of the protest line per se. We definitely want you to fight, you know, where you are most impactful, you know, but regardless of whether it's on a, you know, in the courtroom and or, you know, for the bail's bondsman, you know, or if you're trying to just work with your colleagues in order to educate folks, we definitely want you to join with as many health rights or justice folks, so that, especially justice, and, no shade to the rights or the health folks, but when we talk about reproductive justice, what I know for sure is that the needs of the woman will not be left on the margin when there is conversation about how to advocate for her, making sure that there is proper language, making sure that there are proper statistics, not rhetoric that lawyers are using. It's really important that you offer your expertise to us, right? One of the things that we always are in need of is, a policy analyst, somebody who can help us decipher legislation. When Amendment 1 in Tennessee, was being fought back in 2014, one of the things that was, the hardest piece was trying to even understand the legislation, which was written really vaguely. And it was not easy for just regular folks to understand. Hell, it wasn't easy for many of us to understand. And so, we lost. But I think that one of the reasons that we lost is because it was really hard to, to talk about what the legislation meant or did not mean. Also, other ways that, we could work together is crafting legislation for us, right? Like, what does it mean to work with our legislative champions and help them to craft legislation that is specific to, that has important RJ language and uses that lens in order to write the policy that we, hopefully would be able to pass. One of the things that we've seen that is effective in the past are, legal advocacy toolkits on reproductive justice issues. When the fetal assault law kind of was at its height of us fighting it, one of the things that was offered to the public defenders who were more than not getting a lot of the women who were impacted by the law was a toolkit, so they could understand how to talk about the language that included our messaging, included, case study, that included, just different kind of strategies for public defenders to be able to use, and especially a public defender, right, who may have a ridiculous caseload, 300 or even or more, who does not have time to spend hours upon hours trying to do that work, to do that, research, or to find those statistics, to find that think piece, to, they may not have that. So toolkits are definitely a way that, that we can continue to be supportive to you, and vice versa, right? And you can be supportive to us. And then partner with reproductive justice groups so that we can provide rapid response advocacy strategies when you or your client can't. Again, going back to the Anayaka case, there wasn't, time, as far as we're concerned, was of the essence, and not having, with the RJ group in the state, not utilizing us, because we absolutely tried to be utilized by her lawyer, but not utilizing us, I think, is the reason why, the impact of the law on her was as severe as it was. I mean, RJ is a winning strategy. I don't just say that because I do this work. I say that because this work has proven itself to be effective. Marissa Alexander is a prime example. The fact that we defeated the fetal assault law in partnership with other folks is an example. So we can't, just kind of, it may not be, the normal way that the legal community works, but it still is an effective, it still is an effective strategy. And then join the movement. We need lawyers in this movement. Law for Black Lives. We've got If, When, How. Who has committed their lawyers to RJ issues. But we definitely need as many lawyers on this side of the work as possible. I think for one, it would absolutely help us be more on the offense than the defense. What does it mean to go ahead and have legislation ready to go at the top of a legislative session, as opposed to utilizing lawyers to help us, write policy that, is in response to something that's already put in play. So that's, some strategies that we can say as well. The RJ kind of collective analysis that we want you to walk away from this with is basically that the ability of any woman to determine what happens to her body is directly related to what's happening in her community. And therefore, what's happening in her community can never be left off the table when you're advocating for her, right? Human rights protections or violations will determine an individual's ability to exercise self-determination or not. What does that mean? Were the human rights issues or violations happening in the life of Anna Yoka, happening in the life of Marissa Alexander brought to bear when those lawyers were fighting on behalf of their clients? What type of difference could that have made if those things were brought to bear? We must work with other social justice movements to build a new movement to save our lives and those of our families and communities. So other social justice movements, as far as we're concerned, this is a justice-centered legal movement in my eyes. And so for us working with you all, to me is a partnership that we just can't ignore, something that we've got to do, something that we got to think about all of these different types of strategies, when we're trying to fight, and especially in this current political climate. We can't afford to keep doing things the same way we've been doing them for the last 20 some odd years. We've got to shift the strategy, and what we also can't do is leave reproductive justice on the margins of those strategies, but we need to center that RJ lens. We need to center that RJ strategy and center those folks. What would it have meant if there were other, women convened to speak as survivors of domestic violence in the midst of Marissa Alexander's case? What would it have meant for Anna Yoka to have other women who had considered that, or maybe, even self-induced an abortion, to speak on behalf of to speak, around some of the social determinants that made their lives, whatever situation that caused them to self-abort, these types of things. So we would definitely want to think about how we bring our advocacy strategy to this movement, even in a more effective way, so that we can continue to move the work forward. And intersectional visions for RJ. RJ is going to be achieved when when communities of color have the power to protect and advance our human rights, determine the number and spacings of our kids, protect our bodily integrity, our right to parent our kids, improve our quality of life, obtain the necessary social supports that we need in order to live, develop the leadership and build the social, political, and economic power of those who are most impacted, in this case, people of color, and then support the leadership and power of those who are most excluded, including young people in particular, including women, including gender nonconforming folks, LGBT folks. So it's so important that when we think about, kind of this strategy, this vision, we want you to think about, how does the Law for Black Lives fit into this? How do we fight together? Here are some resources that folks can use. We have a book that just came out by one of our founding mothers, Loretta Ross, called Reproductive Justice. It's a bomb book. You got to get it. Undivided Rights, which was also written by Loretta and other awesome reproductive health and rights folks. Pregnancy and Power, Killing the Black Body, I always say is like the Bible, the RJ Bible, but I haven't finished Loretta's book yet, so I'll be able to totally make that declaration by the time I get to reading Loretta's book. And then Women of Color and the Reproductive Rights Movement by Jennifer Nelson. There are other books, but these are definitely some to begin with that will give you, definitely an understanding and a point of view about the work that we do, to help you understand, better to communicate about the work, and something that you can use even around your research when trying to advocate for your clients. And I think that's it. And I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Cherise, for that amazing presentation. I always walk away whenever Cherise speaks with so much information and so empowered to do the work. We just appreciate you.
Absolutely.
So now we'll move into the panel discussion. where we'll talk about advocating, organizing, and lawyering from a reproductive justice lens. And so we have two amazing organizers, lawyers who practice reproductive justice as a framework. And so I'll introduce them and then we'll get into some questions. So first we have Gerald Haynes, who joined Physicians for Reproductive Health in September 2015 and serves as their Director of Public Policy. Prior to working for that organization, she was the Domestic Policy Analyst with Advocates for Youth. Gerald focused her legal training on reproductive health, rights, and justice. After earning her master's in law at American University, she completed the Law Students for Reproductive Justice, now known as If When How, a fellowship program with placement at Black Women's Health Imperative. Gerald previously served as the immediate past chair of the Women's Information Network, DC's premier professional, political, and social network dedicated to empowering young pro-choice Democratic women. She earned her law degree from Washington University in St. Louis and her Bachelor of Arts degree in communication from Denison University. Gerald is based in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Gerald, for joining us. Next, we have Sequoia. Sequoia is Policy Counsel and Program Manager at Sister Love. She graduated from American University, Washington College of Law with a dual JD degree and master's degree in international development with a concentration in nonprofit management. She is passionate about human rights and access to justice, with an emphasis on bridging the gap between politically marginalized communities and access to civil legal assistance. While in law school, she represented clients who had been subjected to partner violence in the District of Columbia and Maryland on immigration and family law matters through her participation in the Women in Law Clinic. As a law clerk with Maryland Legal Aid, she assisted low-income Marylanders on matters related to family law, consumer law, and elder law, and successfully designed a clinic outreach framework and workshop for pro se litigants in domestic family law cases. While in law school, in addition to serving on the executive boards of the Women's Law Association and Action for Human Rights, she founded the Parents Attending Law School Association and advocated on behalf of pregnant and parenting students. Her work as a research assistant with the Impact Litigation Project involved addressing innovatively the relationship between gender and religion-based violence and repression in Latin America. Thank you so much, Sequoia, for joining us. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. I just want to say I have tried to troubleshoot the issue with the video since, and I just can't figure it out.
Oh, and so we can hear you.
Okay.
But we appreciate you being on anyhow. So let's get into some questions. So for folks who might not know, would you explain, and so we'll start with Sequoia first, if you explain what your day-to-day work looks like.
Yeah, sure. So my day-to-day work looks like, beyond the normal barrage of emails, escalating beyond 100. My normal day looks like working with Sister Love has a full-time fellow to identify any new administrative advocacy opportunities by way of sort of scouring through regulations.gov. Other things, another sort of normal activity is participating in some standing coalition meetings. We serve on a number of coalitions that really work at the intersection of our unique place as a public health centered organization that really implements a reproductive justice framework to the way in which we do our public health work.
Thank you so much. I think it's especially important for people who are maybe thinking about practicing using a reproductive justice lens. So, Joe, would you also explain what your day-to-day work looks like?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Just want to make sure I got off mute. So actually, my day-to-day is a lot dependent on what is happening with Congress and with the current administration. So it's actually rare that I have can fully map out my day or week or even month, just given how volatile the situations may be based on what Congress is doing. So for Physicians for Reproductive Health, I run our federal policy program, which means that I'm responsible for, paying attention to anything that's happening with Congress related to healthcare, particularly, related to our main issue areas, which include, access to the full range of reproductive healthcare services, including abortion and contraception. And, I'm focused on training our physicians on how to be advocates around. So I spend a lot of time just sort of watching C-SPAN and watching what happens with particularly the Senate. We recently saw bills that were being introduced and voted on that restricted access to abortion after 20 weeks. We've been paying a lot of attention to what's happening with the healthcare debates around the Affordable Care Act, in part because the Affordable Care Act did so much to increase access to reproductive health care. And so, the fight to keep it intact is something that, we've been monitoring closely. Like Sequoia, I also work on a lot of coalitions. So I do spend a fair amount of time in meetings and on conference calls, but really, my main day-to-day is just kind of monitoring what's happening with Congress and the administration and how that can impact, particularly our providers, since we do represent, reproductive healthcare providers.
Thank you so much for sharing. And so we'll stay with you for the next question. But how do you apply reproductive justice to your work?
So I think one of the things that is important for most people when they, work for repro organizations is to understand what type of organization you work for. So I work specifically for, it's a reproductive health organization, but does strive to utilize as much as possible the reproductive justice framework. We want to be very clear. We recognize we are not an RJ organization. That's not, the sort of, that's not what our sort of lane is, but we recognize that we have the opportunity to use the RJ framework in our work to really ground our providers in understanding what their patients, having a sense of what their patients are going through and how we are utilizing language. And, just paying attention to, how we talk about issues, who are we centering, whose stories are being told when our providers are engaging with their legislators or engaging with the press. We want to make sure that they are well trained, that they're not marginalizing their patients in the ways that they're speaking about these issues. So we really utilize the reproductive justice frame to make sure that we are addressing the full range of reproductive health care, that we're not just focused on abortion or we're not just focused on access to contraception, that we're placing that in the context of the lived experience of our providers' patients, so that they have a sense of, when they're making recommendations or when they're, again, when they're talking about these issues with legislators or to the press, that they are placing these issues in the broader context of patients' lived experiences.
Thank you. And so Sequoia, how do you apply RJ to your work?
So we are an organization that sort of has a dual purpose. Our advocacy program really sprouted out of the work that was largely held down by our executive director. And our original foundings was as a client services organization. So we do direct testing services and support and provide support services and limited case management to women living with HIV, specifically women of African descent. And something that's integral to how I conduct all of my advocacy efforts is that I really want to be centered and grounded in the experiences and the needs of folks living with HIV. And so a term that we use a lot is called MIPA, or the meaningful involvement of people living with AIDS, and recently modified to include just people living with HIV. And that means making sure that in all of the work that we're doing, that those folks are present, that those folks folks feel included and heard, and that those processes, particularly with respect to Georgia, in the legislative process, oftentimes the most marginalized communities are not the ones at the table. So, for example, when it comes to drafting legislation, having a working group with some of our support group participants, or opening it up to the larger community to talk about the components of that draft legislation and really give them an opportunity to weigh in on what that looks like for them and their communities.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And so our next question is, how do you, how is working using the RJ framework, how is it different or similar to how we are traditionally taught to advocate and practice law? And we can go with Sequoia. We can go with you first.
So one of the things that I really kind of from my law school experience was that as a woman of color, as a woman from a low-income background, a lot of the things that I needed in order to be successful in advocating for my community, I got from my community and not from law school. Oftentimes, client relationships, specifically in the litigation context, are seen as very contractual or transactional. And oftentimes, there's really no exploration of an individual's or the practicing attorney's biases and how they show up to do the work. Oftentimes, the lawyer is thought of as the person who originates all thoughts and opinions and really is leading the direction of the advocacy in a particular client's case, or even the method of the strategy or method to take when it comes to even legislative advocacy or any sort of or any other sort of demonstrative change. And I think what's different, particularly as someone who studied more so from the at the intersections of applying gender justice and international human rights framework, and then later on in the development of my career applying the reproductive justice framework, is that all of that is incorrect. Specific to how you view your relationship to the client and the outcome in a particular case. When talking about strategy and methods, I think it's sort of equally important for the lawyer to make sure that they are giving equal weight to the client and the community in which they're working, as to what an appropriate response to an issue is, and to take a step back. Because I think this will happen too. Sometimes the community will look to you for the answer when really they already have the answer. They just need you to apply the skills to help them get there. So I think we have to do a little bit internally to resist the urge to provide an answer all the time and really listen to the folks with whom we're working and advocating for to lead us in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. And so same question for you, Gerald.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that Sequoia could sort of speak to more of more traditional lawyering. I would also like to to speak to the policy side and how particularly folks who might be working for like a mainstream reproductive health organization or even other social justice organizations, and how utilizing a reproductive justice framework operates differently. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the RJ framework is the way that it centers the lived experiences, particularly of women and communities of color, and the folks who are who are typically marginalized, or the folks who are typically set to the outskirts. And I think it's a very different way than we're typically used to thinking about how we're approaching the work. And so in more mainstream organizations or other organizations that may be more focused on a rights-based approach, it's a very sort of linear way of thinking about how they're setting goals, how you're determining, if you're setting a legislative strategy, for example, and how you are sort of measuring success. If you're not taking into account, the intersectional lives that people live and the other factors that might come into play, and you're only singularly looking at an issue, you really miss a lot of opportunities to be more collaborative and engaged, and look for solutions that are actually more impactful. And so I think that's one of the, we are now seeing more groups understanding how utilizing the reproductive justice framework actually gets us a lot further. If we are, for example, if you're an organization that is particularly focused on abortion rights, but you're not thinking about the other oppressions that are in place or the other factors that are contributing to why someone might not be able to access abortion, you miss those opportunities to then be engaged in some of the other work that can make, access to abortion a lot easier. And so one of the campaigns and coalitions that I feel very privileged to get to work on is a coalition that is seeking to overturn the Hyde Amendment, which is a restriction that, restricts people who have public insurance, so folks who have Medicaid, folks who get their insurance from the government, from being able to use that funding for abortion. And for a long time, many in the repro community did not see that as sort of a primary issue. Because abortion was still legally available, they weren't paying attention to the fact that, not being able to pay for your abortion is actually a huge prohibition. And so it doesn't matter if it's legally available if you can't afford it or if your insurance doesn't cover it for a number of reasons. And so we're seeing, a larger shift of mainstream organizations and folks who are working, more focused on reproductive health and reproductive rights understand that by undertaking a reproductive justice frame, it becomes, our strategies are actually much richer and much, we're able to move them forward more quickly because we are addressing multiple issues, and the RJ frame allows us to bring more people in because we're approaching an issue from a more multifaceted position as opposed to a more singular position. So I think that's one of, at least in a policy context, that's one of the big differences in utilizing a more traditional policy framework.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and it leads me to the next question, which is specifically for somebody who might be just starting out. This might be their first or second introduction to RJ, and hey, this is really important. It's important that we practice from this lens. And so just want to know, and this is for either of you, how you make RJ a part of your work. If you're just coming into an understanding. And then additionally, how you make a part of your work, say if you're working for the public defender's office or some other entity that it doesn't usually use an RJ lens. And you spoke a bit about that before, Gerald, but just wanted to ask those additional questions. So either of you, Gerald or Sequoia, or both of you, feel free to answer that question.
I can start. So I think one of the things that people can do is really understand power dynamics and how those can be at play in your organization and in the work that's being done. And, look and see who is at the table and who's not at the table, who's being represented and whose voices are not being heard. And particularly if you're an organization that says that you are, working for a particular community or a particular client base, how involved are folks from those communities and client base? Do you have folks from those communities on your staff? How are you actually reaching out? And how are you actually measuring, the impact that your work is having? I'm constantly surprised by the number of sort of organizations that state that they're doing X, Y, and Z type of work, and yet, their staff doesn't reflect that. Their actual work output doesn't reflect that. So I think, understanding what the, again, the different power dynamics and how, asking those questions, what does your organization's board look like? Who are the decision makers? And are they, actually reflecting the values of RJ? Are they actually, pushing people to be more inclusive and to think more broadly about the impact of that work? I think for people who may be working for, if you're working for a law firm, how are you utilizing resources? I know many law firms have pro bono practices that they do. And, for people who work for law firms, your income is probably a little bit higher than someone like myself who's working for a nonprofit. So how are you able to utilize your own resources to help? Are you able to volunteer your time? Are you able to, make financial contributions? Are you able to make in-kind contributions? So reaching out to, local groups and seeing what kind of support could they use? Is it, they might just need something as simple as being able to make color copies of something, or, be able to use a phone line or to have conference calls, or, those types of things that your organization may have access to, and those types of resources that might be, something that could be contributed to a smaller organization or a group of volunteers. So just looking for opportunities to utilize your resources in ways that you might not be currently thinking about.
Just to piggy up, sorry. I just wanted to add something to what Gerald was saying, specific to the law firm setting or in the litigation setting. Something that's really common, particularly in firms, and this may be more so for small or mid-sized firms, but you generally have an opportunity to meet together as a staff and sort of with your fellow staff attorneys, and what have you, to discuss I'm sorry, I have a very angry toddler. To discuss sort of like where you all are at with a particular case. Case strategies, difficulties with the client or difficulties in the case. And it really gives you an opportunity to sort of look at, provide your own personal insight and also challenge others. 1 second, baby. Challenging the ways in which people are applying their thoughts and ideas to the work, and also an opportunity to analyze help other people to analyze their positions on a particular case using an RJ framework. And then also, like, influence within firms to encourage training that more so orient folks who may not be representing the communities that they're working with to do more to instigate and probe their own internal biases and how that may be showing up, and making them an ineffective advocate, and how they can shore up those inefficiencies.
Yeah, thank you. That's some amazing steps and information. So it also kind of leads us to the question around, like, what would you say to students who are preparing to start their careers as someone who's looking to transition to working in a field similar to yours using an RJ framework? Like, so how can they prepare themselves to do this work, and what should they expect? So we can start with Gerald. You want to go first?
Oh, sure. So I think, one of the things that I really appreciate Cherise shared were some of those incredible books. I was very fortunate to learn about the RJ framework in law school through the organization. It's now If and How. When I was in school, it was called Law Students for Reproductive Justice. But it's what first introduced me to the framework. And I really, I had considered myself pro-choice, but really didn't feel like it quite got to a lot of what I was feeling and what I was expressing. And I really love that the framework is a much broader frame, that it includes both, the right not to become a parent, but it also includes parental rights. So, reading resources and just getting yourself as knowledgeable and familiar with the concepts of reproductive justice, I think are really helpful. Killing the Black Body was a transformational book for me. And it's something that I encourage anyone who is considering getting into this field to, just so that there's an understanding of the history that's there. And several of the other books that were mentioned are books that I had an opportunity to read and review, so that, it gave me a good sort of framework. So I would say I would encourage folks to, to take the time to do some of their own research and try to get an understanding of those frames. And then I would also encourage them to, look at the websites and the social media of of many of the RJ organizations, particularly organizations who are doing incredible work in the South, because their work is on the groundwork is really life-changing to those communities. And so, looking at the work that they're doing and how, they will let you know ways that you can support them. Almost always, being able to financially support and contribute to those organizations is vital. But also, showing support and love if they have different types of campaigns, Twitter campaigns or thunderclaps or that sort of thing, supporting them on social media, sharing their articles, uplifting the work that they are doing, I think is a really important way. And, it's a way of starting to get to know the players in this community who are doing this work. And the other thing I would say is if you have the opportunity and the funding to attend conferences or to, go to events, I would highly encourage that. We just came back from the Sister Song Conference in New Orleans, which was just an incredible space to engage with other folks who are doing this work and network and learn, and to continue growing and learning and about the topics that are coming up and understanding, what's happening. And I would also say the other thing, just as a federal policy person is, to pay attention to what's happening in Congress and to get to know, your legislators, both at the federal level, so your members of Congress, your senators, your representatives, but also at the state and local levels, and understand, a lot of reproductive justice issues are becoming more and more political. And so being part of the political process, making sure that you are registered to vote, making sure that you understand what the ballot issues are, making sure that you understand where certain candidates stand on a lot of these issues, and understanding that, elections have consequences. So making sure that you're engaged in, what's happening in the political sphere, because a lot of things that are being voted on, the main people who are suffering the consequences of those laws are typically, communities of color. So paying a lot of attention to what's happening in the political space.
Thank you. Sequoia, same question to you.
I really second everything that Gerald said. I think she covered just about everything. One of the things, if I had to add something, which I absolutely do not, one of the things that I would add is the importance of mentorship and also understanding your own personal direction. And that RJ work is not, only doing sexual and reproductive justice work, but it also, as Cherise covered in her presentation, it includes environmental justice. It includes developmental justice, it includes economic justice. And so there are a lot of intersecting movements where you can be applying this framework, or where you already may have been applying this framework without even knowing it, which is much of what I have been doing. And where I was introduced to the RJ framework was through the If, When, How Reproductive Justice Lawyering Program. And yet everything that is indicative of my lived experience has been reflected in the RJ framework. And so, or is reflected within the realm of RJ. And so I would say, drawing on your own personal experiences and using that as a guide as to where you would like to land. And then from there, just making sure that you stay true to the core values and principles, and applying that to wherever you decide to be, even if that's, representing, I don't know, big time corporate law firms and forestry deals in the Amazon.
Thank you so much for that. And so what policies, both at either the state, local, or federal level, should we be, if you can name a couple, should we be focusing on or paying attention on, based on working from this framework? And I know it covers a lot, so just what stands out to you?
I can talk about our current ones. Give me 1 second. Okay. So one of the things are Okay, actually, I'll go next. I'm having meltdowns. So, Gerald, would you take it?
Of course.
Thanks.
Yeah, and yeah, I would say, so some of the main policies to be paying attention to are, some of the more obvious ones would be, any sorts of abortion bans, but we're also seeing an increase in bans on contraceptive coverage, which doesn't make a lot of sense, in part because one of the ways that you prevent unintended pregnancies is making sure that people have access to to contraception. So paying attention to, efforts to, to really restrict people's access to both, contraceptive coverage and counseling, as well as emergency contraception. So, places that are restricting pharmacies from carrying emergency contraception, or pharmacies that actually will either keep the emergency contraception behind the counter, which they're not supposed to do, or require people to show an ID in order to get contraception, which is also they're not supposed to do. So really looking at those policies that are seeking to keep people away from contraception. One of the other areas that has a big impact particularly for young people is the issue of sex education, and whether or not their state, only has abstinence-only sex education, or if they live in a state where where it's a more comprehensive approach to sex education, because we know that good sex education also goes much further to making sure that young people have the resources and information that they need to make responsible decisions. So, seeing, checking in with your state and seeing what are your state's sex education policies. The big one that we've just been tracking recently, it has been the healthcare, looking at people's access to healthcare and whether or not, they're able to get their basic needs met. If they're able to have, even if, just being able to get in and seeing a doctor and staying healthy, so that, both to prevent unintended pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections, but also so that when they do decide that they want to become pregnant and start a family, that they also have healthy, that they're healthy to begin with, because then that, has an impact on maternal mortality rates. That if people have access to good underlying health care, it means that they can then have healthier pregnancies, and they can help get treatment for conditions that can then become exacerbated during a pregnancy. So I would also say, just paying attention to what your state's particular reproductive health care and healthcare in general laws are. And some states we're seeing, positive laws that are happening, which is really great. So the most recent one was Illinois signed a bill into place that protects access to abortion care and covers funding for abortion services. We've seen, proactive bills in Oregon and in California. So in addition to some of the terrible things that are happening at the state level, we're also seeing some proactive bills that are happening at the state level. So those would just be some of the big ones that I would encourage folks to pay attention to.
Hi, I'm back. I think just to add to that, I think from the state-based perspective, Georgia's legislative, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Georgia's legislative session lasts all of 40 days, not necessarily 40 consecutive days, but still more or less 40 days. So there's not as large a commitment, from my perspective, as maybe some other states, to really get involved in the legislative process. In addition to some of the different issue areas that Gerald mentioned, Cherise also talked about HIV criminalization of pregnancy outcomes. In Georgia, we've been working to create a collective action around crisis pregnancy centers. And I think that, to select an issue area that's important to you, and to really try to plug into your local communities. It's even more helpful if your local community is also the community in which you wish to practice in the near immediate future. because that also helps you in terms of like facilitating connections with folks around the work that you see yourself doing. And I think that I might be moving to the next question, so I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So this is the last question before we take questions from the rest of the attendees. But in your opinion, how could or would advocacy in the legal profession be transformed if more advocates and lawyers worked using an RJ framework? So we can, whoever wants to go first.
So Corey, why don't you start since you're already heading there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And since I have a moment where they're not both screaming at the same time. So I would say that one of the things one of the most immediate things that would happen is there would be probably a whole lot less undoing of bad policy, because the voices and the experiences of marginalized folks would have been considered at the forefront and not at the back end, or after, 20 years of poor policies and disparate impact on very specific communities. I think also, and even a more tangible aspect of that, even here in Georgia, for example, when people are really working from a choice framework instead of a justice framework, we had a piece of legislation that was quote unquote championed by one of our conservative members who is allied with us from a public health point of view, where they passed what was seen as a progressive testing and access to treatment expansion bill, but it was tied right alongside renewed funding for crisis pregnancy centers, which are clinics or places, I don't know what you want to call them. It's not a clinic because there's usually no one with any sort of medical degree or background on staff that provide testing, and oftentimes their primary goal is to dissuade folks from seeking abortion as an option to terminate, or whether or not they're seeking to terminate a pregnancy. And so you have these sort of bad decision making that seeks to piece and parcel the way in which people live their lives, and that's just not realistic. And so what you have that quote unquote for some seemed a good and a positive bill ended up being poor and pretty bad. But I think that's one of the greatest ways. Also, I think that the legal profession in a lot of ways is racist, is paternalistic, like a lot of professions in this country that have a history of discriminating and prohibiting the inclusion of women, of people of color. And so I think that by using the RJ framework, we'll not only do work within the legal community to seek to diversify and create a more equal and just profession, but then we're also going to have that impact will be lasting on our communities and the folks that we're seeking to serve.
I think that's really great. I would say, I think the way that our work would be done, the way that our organizations are structured, if there was a more of an RJ frame that was used, would result in the work being done in a much different way. I think you would have, people being justly compensated for their work. I think you would no longer have things like unpaid internships or, where people are getting credit for the work that's done by other staff members, particularly on writings and communications and, press opportunities, that those would be, more evenly distributed, that the people who are actually doing the work are the ones who are getting the sort of visible credit and not just those at the top who are sort of taking credit for their staff. I think you would have, a real understanding of the role of white supremacy in our society and even among progressive organizations, really, understanding the ways that the unexamined white supremacy really is holding back people of color and communities of color within organizations. So, if organizations really undertook an RJ frame, I think you would see, how work is valued, would be valued differently, which skills are being rewarded and which skills are being sort of the emotional labor that is typically borne, particularly by women of color, that doesn't get justly recognized or compensated. I think you would see more of that being recognized. So I really think the way that our work is done would be particularly in the policy world. So I think Sequoia hit on one of the big things that that would get changed in, and that's the accountability that we would have for lawmakers and legislators. We wouldn't feel like, we wouldn't support bills that threw different community members under the bus. You wouldn't support, a sort of so-called reproductive rights bill that still includes provisions that, include parental notification laws for minors seeking abortion. That would never be considered, something that groups could support if they were taking a full RJ approach to work. So you would see organizations, I think, working much closely, much better aligned, and again, centering, the lived experiences of the people that they are purporting to be serving. I think you would see a lot more of that happening if organizations took more of an RJ lens.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's always helpful to ground ourselves in the world we want to live in, to dream. So I appreciate that. So we have a couple of minutes to ask both Cherise, Gerald, Sequoia questions. And so we can open it up now, and if folks will unmute yourselves if you have a question, and you can ask them directly. So we'll open it up now for questions. Okay. So if you're talking, we can't hear you, but also don't be shy. No questions? All right, it looks like y'all covered everything. So
also, just really quickly, if you have any questions and your camera is shy, you could also chat them into the chat box.
Oh yeah, do that too. So I guess while we're waiting, if we could just, Cherise, is there any specific policy that Sister Reach is working around that we should keep our eye on, especially for the folks living in the South or in Tennessee?
Absolutely. I definitely think that we can't ignore the fact that though one of our Democrats placed the fetal assault law on the table to get a co-signer, to kind of get the law going back again, even though it's already sunset. I think that we would be a bit irresponsible to think that he won't try it again. We're trying to get our research released quickly, in time to kind of meet the legislative session, once it begins in January. But in the meantime and in between time, I just think that, we need to be thinking about that. I think that, this is an amazing opportunity for folks to be proactive around comp sex ed strategy and legislation. Here in the state of Tennessee, we've seen an influx of sterilization policies being implemented, and actions, to go with those policies. It makes sense as far as we're concerned to, I know that we're going to be calling on folks to help out. One of our legislative champions here, Ramesh Akbari, who is going to take on an anti-sterilization bill this coming January session. Sister Reach plans to be as helpful as we possibly can as a C3 with that work, but definitely to bring a bit of messaging and context around it, specific to the fetal assault law, because really it's connected to that, but it's also connected to abortion efforts. So we're definitely seeing an increase of LARC coercion across the state, but across the South. And we're also, so there are definitely points of entry around coercive practices to do some legal advocacy, as well as sterilization practices to do some legal advocacy. I'm trying to think, is anything else? Like I said, the HIV criminalization piece is something that we can't just we've got to pay attention to that. Of course, like we heard earlier, thinking about how we do work on the Hyde Amendment, but in a strategic way. I think the way that we fight it in the North isn't the way that we fight it in the South. And so it's really, it's not even on the table in the South, because there is no expansion of Medicaid in the South. So I think that we need to, just kind of think about, kind of what does it mean to continue to fight for an expansion of Medicaid? How do we continue to put pressure on healthcare, around healthcare reform and access? And then really look at, are there legal ramifications for states not offering healthcare? Folks are dying, without any healthcare, or slowly dying. So I think that we need to be thinking about that. All of the social supports, I think that we need to look at what it means to gut teen pregnancy prevention money, in an age where, young people are, especially Southern young people, are contracting syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, herpes, and HIV at a ridiculous, like rolling back the clock to 15, 20 years ago, the way the contraction rates are happening right now, transmission rates. And so, there's something to be said about, who's responsible. What does it mean to sue the White House? Whatever. Hey, I'm just saying, can I say that? Okay. What does it mean to sue 45? What does it mean to sue this administration for what they have done? I personally, my own, I've been kind of saying this, I'm going to say it because it's being recorded and people are watching. I really want to put out here, I'm going to put it out here again in the universe of what it means to fight for comp-sex ed to be healthcare. We need to continue to think about how we need to reframe comp-sex ed. If it is a preventative method, then it's a public health thing. It needs to be a part of healthcare. So I definitely want us to consider that as well.
Thank you. No.
Can I just say one last thing too? And this is me as an individual, not as a representative of any organization under any political thing. But I think one of the big things that the last election, I think, showed is we really need more people who look like us in office. And that means that we need to put our money where our mouth is. And that means supporting, not just candidates in our area, but, there are some incredible people who are working to really elevate, in particular, Black women into mayoral positions, into state legislative and congressional positions, and they need our funds in part because we've seen particularly a lot of Black women being told, you need to wait your turn, it's not your time, and we need to push back against that and basically say it is our time. Because, these are the folks who are really going to make sure that many of these policies, many of these programs that are so important to our communities are actually funded, are actually supported. And they need our bodies. They need us out there canvassing. There's a lot that people can do before the 2018 election to really make a difference in what our electorate looks like, and making sure that we are electing people who look like us, who have our issues at heart, whether that's bundling money, whether that's, you getting 10 of your friends to pull together $100 so that you can send $1,000 to a campaign. And there are a lot of really great PACs and groups who are focused on specifically electing women of color into office. And so I would also say that's something that, particularly for folks who have resources, who have who work at jobs that provide them additional income or have access to people who have income, really doing what you can to help support candidates who are really going to prioritize our issues and make sure that programming and funding for our issues get, because a lot of that happens at the local level, a lot of that happens at the state level, as well as at the federal level. So really want to make sure people understand that connection, that, we really need to, you've got to support, you got to be active, and make sure that, the election goes the way that we want it. We cannot afford to sit on the sidelines anymore.
Thank you for that. Sequoia, did you want to answer that question too?
No, I didn't.
Okay. So we'll open it up one more time before we close for any other questions. Okay. So it looks like there aren't any more questions. So just want to thank all of you so much for your brilliance and your insight, and for sharing that with us. We appreciate it. And so we have recorded this also, so we'll send out the recording too. But want to thank y'all again, everybody for joining us. Really appreciate folks being open to having this conversation and learning from these amazing women. And so that's all we have. We appreciate y'all. Thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks y'all. Peace.
Bye.
Bye.